Good evening. For those of you that I have not met, I am Joanne Drake, and I currently serve as the Chief Administrative Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. In honor of our men and women in uniform who serve this country and protect our freedoms around the world, it is our tradition to ask you to join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And this evening, in light of the recent hurricanes in Texas and in Florida and Puerto Rico, and the firestorm that we have going in the state of California right now, I would like to add those to the list of those that we honor tonight. So if you would stand and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Be seated. We are grateful that you all are here this evening. Luckily, our winds died down from yesterday. Before we hear from our distinguished guest, I want to thank a good friend of the Reagan Foundation that is here with us this evening, Mr. Ed Atzinger, the founder, CEO, and director of the Salem Media Group. Thank you, Ed. So I want to start this evening by taking a quick survey. I don't need you to raise your hands, but I do want you to really think about my questions in your own mind. Have you used a cell phone today? Did you perhaps wake up to an alarm where your clock radio came on? Have you logged onto the internet at any time today? Did you start your day with a morning television show, a news show on one of the networks? Have you ever had to call 911 on the telephone? Do you know someone who is deaf or hard of hearing and uses closed captioning on their television? Were you, or maybe you still are, an avid listener to a daily talk show host on an AM or FM radio station? Do you watch the Super Bowl, and do you remain seated for the halftime show? And admit it, aren't you just all looking forward to the next political campaign when you can watch or listen to candidates 24 hours a day tell us that their messages were approved by them? If you answered yes to any or all of those questions, then you are directly affected by the daily oversight, regulations, and control of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. I'd say that 100% of our audience fits into that category. The FCC regulates not only the airwaves used by your favorite radio and network stations, but also the programming content. The FCC also acts as a police agency of the airwaves and can even fine broadcasters for violating public decency standards on the air. Once in a while, the FCC can even revoke a broadcaster's license, keeping him or her off the air permanently. Some of you may remember that the FCC has fined radio host Howard Stern numerous times for his profane language. And who doesn't remember the fine that CBS received for the Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction during the halftime performance at Super Bowl 2004. One of the more recent controversial issues at the FCC is, of course, the regulation of the internet. As we all know, whether we like it or not, high-speed internet access is critical to almost everything that happens in this country and around the world today. It provides education, retail and commerce, economic opportunity, job creation, and even civic engagement, just to get the list started. But you know, there are many areas of this country where high-speed internet is simply not available, and one of the top priorities of this evening's guest speaker is to close the so-called digital divide between those who have access to cutting-edge communications and those who do not. Where normally all you find is a great deal of government regulation, the FCC chairman is currently working to cut the red tape of the government, promote innovative approaches for better products and services, and attempting to create an environment that will encourage infrastructure investment. Now you're saying to yourself, what does all that mean? We're going to hear what that means. You know, we're used to firsts here at the Reagan Library. We've had plenty over the years. Even on Dedication Day, it was the first time 5 living US presidents had ever gathered together at a presidential library. Since then, we've hosted the first Republican presidential debate at a presidential library. We are the first and only presidential library to exhibit Air Force One, and the list goes on. We've had presidents and heads of state, cabinet secretaries, authors, broadcasters, military heroes, historians, educators, and even an astronaut. Tonight, I believe, is the first time that the Reagan Library has hosted the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Our distinguished guest is an attorney whose professional resume is both long and extremely impressive for someone this young. He has had both private sector experience at companies like Verizon and a private law firm, and as counsel in the public sector to the likes of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the FCC, and the US Department of Justice. His undergraduate degree is from where else? Harvard University, and he obtained his law degree from the University of Chicago. On the personal side of his resume, he is the first generation son of physicians who immigrated from India. He is married with 2 young children, and I have it on good authority that he's a fan of college basketball. If necessary, we will remind him that we are in both Trojan and Bruin territory out here. In 2012, he began a 5-year term as one of the 5 commissioners of the FCC, and in January of this year, he was appointed as chairman by President Trump. And in the spring, he was given a new 5-year term. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to ask you to join me in welcoming the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, the Honorable Ajit Pai.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for that very kind introduction. Joanne didn't mention that her Villanova Wildcats beat the Kansas Jayhawks a few years ago. Very diplomatic on her part. I also want to recognize, before I start my formal remarks, Mr. Tom Mew. I don't know if he's in the audience, but Tom gave me and one of my key coworkers a behind-the-scenes tour of the Reagan Library. And for those of you who haven't had a chance, you really should take a time and just stroll, not sprint, not run, but stroll through it and appreciate the grandeur of this building. It was really something else, and I wish I had more time, frankly, to do it. For me, it is an honor to be here, but I feel somewhat sorry for you. After all, as President Reagan might have said at this very moment, the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the FCC, and I'm here to entertain you." That said, I do have some good news to deliver. You might not know this, but the Reagan Library is actually an FCC licensee. The library holds a license for 2A radios used for janitorial personnel communications, among other things. So the real reason I was here is not so much to deliver these remarks, but to conduct an undercover investigation to make sure that the library was appropriately using this license. And after touring this beautiful place, I am pleased to report to Ms. Drake that the library has passed the inspection and the license is being held in good stead. But seriously, though, I was thrilled when I received the invitation to join you tonight. Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president the same month in which I turned 8 years old. He led the United States during my formative years. When I think of my childhood, I think of President Reagan. And I can't imagine a better time or place to have come of age than in Reagan's America. To me, at least, it was a time of hope and optimism. Movies like Top Gun and Rocky IV topped the box office. They might not have been high art, but they sure were entertaining, and they made you proud to be an American. Down the road in Los Angeles, we hosted a very successful Olympics in 1984. That U.S. team, as you might remember, was led by icons Carl Lewis and Edwin Moses and Mary Lou Retton and Michael Jordan. They might not have won every gold medal, but it sure did feel like it. And in those days, it did indeed seem like morning in America. As President Reagan put it in his 1984 re-election campaign, our country was prouder and stronger and better. And that's certainly how I remember it. I was raised in the small town of Parsons, Kansas. Parsons was middle America, literally and figuratively. The closest big city, or at least what we thought of as a big city, was Joplin, Missouri, about an hour away. In the 1980s, my hometown and others like it felt like places of hope, of dreams, of faith and family, of Americans who loved their country. The future was limitless and hard work made for a better life. This was the America that I grew up in. This was Ronald Reagan's America. As I've gotten older, and particularly after becoming the father of those two young kids, my appreciation for and admiration of President Reagan has only grown. And that's why a portrait of the president is in my office suite to this day. Reagan's accomplishments, of course, were impressive. His economic policies produced 19 million new jobs and 7 straight years of economic growth above 3%. And to put that in perspective, the last time we had a single year of economic growth that robust was in 2005. His foreign policy, of course, was powerful. He applied military and economic pressure to the Soviet Union, and he called it what it was, an evil empire. More than anyone else, he helped end the Cold War and communism's march along with it. Hundreds of millions were freed from tyranny, a legacy that lives on today. Indeed, one can go to Berlin today and see that a city that remains unified and free 3 decades after Ronald Reagan's courageous call to tear down this wall. Now, these are, of course, the highlights of the Reagan presidency that most people know. Imagine many of you do, too. But as the chairman of the FCC, I have a special interest in the progress that was made in communications and technology during the Reagan administration. Did you know, for example, that it was an executive order signed by President Reagan that first made the Pentagon's Global Positioning System, or GPS, available for civilian use? Given some of the Southern California traffic, I imagine that some of you might have used that technology to find the best way to get here tonight. And the FCC chairmen who served during the Reagan administration were incredible leaders and visionaries. Mark Fowler and Dennis Patrick each did a fantastic job leading the agency, and I'm privileged to call each a friend. They moved aggressively to eliminate unnecessary rules and implement President Reagan's deregulatory philosophy. They set a high bar for those who came after them, and I strive every day to try to meet that bar. Most notably, the Reagan FCC eliminated the so-called fairness doctrine. This misnamed government dictate suppressed the discussion of controversial issues on our nation's airwaves and was an affront to the First Amendment. The Reagan FCC also built the political foundation for auctioning licenses to Spectrum, a free market innovation that was doubted back then, but is widely accepted today. The Reagan FCC introduced what is called price cap regulation, reducing the government's role in micromanaging profits and increasing consumer welfare. And the Reagan FCC set the stage for much of the innovation that we see today. In 1985, for example, the FCC had the foresight to set aside what were generally thought to be junk bands, parts of the spectrum that no one wanted. And they set these bands aside for anybody to use, what today we call unlicensed spectrum. And today, entrepreneurs have really put it to work. Thanks to the FCC's vision back then, we now use unlicensed services all the time, whether we access Wi-Fi or use Bluetooth or simply check a baby monitor. So when Reagan left office, was America better off than it had been 8 years before? You bet. But to me, President Reagan's greatest accomplishment, and the one most relevant to my remarks tonight, is that he restored a collective feeling of pride in America and a sense of optimism about our future. He made us believe in ourselves again. And in the late 1970s, that belief was in doubt. The Vietnam War and Watergate still cast a shadow. We saw 14% inflation, high unemployment, an energy crisis, and the Iran hostage crisis. Just before President Reagan's inauguration, only 19% of Americans were satisfied with the way things were going, and for good reason. By his second term, that number had leaped to 69%. As Pulitzer Prize winner John Meacham put it, freedom from self-doubt, from the Soviet threat, from uneasiness about our national power and capacity to do great things, freedom was Reagan's gift to the country. Well, what about now? Well, America today, of course, is nothing like the country that President Reagan inherited. Unemployment is at 4.2%. Inflation is at 2%. Economic growth was 3.1% last quarter, the strongest number in 3 years. Yet too many Americans are frustrated. According to Gallup, only 25% of Americans are satisfied with the way things are going. That's up from 18% last July, but hardly where we want it to be. And what about the years to come? Well, in his beautiful farewell letter to the American people, Ronald Reagan reiterated his eternal optimism for our nation's future. And he wrote memorably that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. I share that view, but too many of our fellow citizens do not. According to a recent Pew survey, nearly twice as many Americans said the future for the next generation would be worse than things are today. And this is actually a slight improvement over surveys from 2016. So this pessimism is not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. It's an American problem. Well, you might ask, what's going on here? Well, I think that part of the reason can be found in a report that came out last month. The Economic Innovation Group released what it calls its Distressed Communities Index. And it basically shows that the economic gains over the past few years have largely gone to affluent areas. But distressed communities are falling behind. In recent years, 52% of new jobs and 57% of new businesses have been created in prosperous communities that represent only 27% of our population. By contrast, about 1 in 6 Americans, 52 million people, live in economically distressed communities that have been declining for years. And if you live in one of these distressed communities and you feel like your only hope is to move away from home, well, a low national unemployment rate is frankly cold comfort. I also believe that there's a second related cause for America's uneasiness, and that is technology. Technology is changing almost every aspect of how we live, how we work, how we learn, how we interact with friends and loved ones, you name it. And big change can create big angst. For example, think about the roughly 3% of the US labor force, 5 million people who drive for a living, long-haul truckers, cabbies, and the like. Imagine how they must feel when they read the latest article about the ascendance of driverless cars. But it's not just the scale of technological change that has people feeling uneasy. It's also the pace. The change is coming so fast, and it will only get faster as we move ahead. And so given all this, I think it's worth asking, what would President Reagan think? What would he do? First and foremost, I believe that Reagan, the eternal optimist, would focus not only on the challenges created by new technology, but also on the potential. And this isn't just my speculation. President Reagan basically said as much 30 years ago in a speech that he delivered at Purdue University. And the passage is a bit long, but it's so spot on for this moment that I hope that you will indulge me. How can we best foster the economic growth that leads to the creation of jobs in the first place, President Reagan asked, before answering it this way. Perhaps it would be best to begin by considering high technology and certain fears that high technology sometimes seems to instill. The computers I saw in your classroom, the robots and other high-tech devices, some fear that these innovations will destroy more jobs than they create, that technology is in some way the enemy of job formation. And yet, we need only look at our nation's actual experience to see that this is not so. It's true that over the years, adjustments have had to be made as older industries gave way to newer. But these adjustments were made, and today our nation employs some 113 million people. No, technology is not the enemy of job creation, but its parent, the very source of our economic dynamism and creativity. Now, if that was President Reagan's reaction then, imagine his reaction to the possibilities of the internet and the world of technology today. A central theme of a 21st century Reagan White House could well be that it is morning in digital America. We need to embrace the challenges of the internet age with that same optimism. We need to recognize that technology can be a gateway to a better way of life for people and in places that are struggling to adjust. And so let's take an honest look at what's happening with technology and what it means. The reason why this is such an exciting and, yes, unsettling time is that major technological advances are converging at once. Artificial intelligence, or AI, and machine learning are progressing quickly. Virtual and augmented reality applications are becoming a reality. 3D printing is enabling anyone to create hardware. Smartphones and the wireless networks that enable them are becoming smarter. The device in your pocket has more computing power than the most powerful supercomputer in the world when President Reagan was in office. And with cloud computing, more than 2 billion people across the planet have access to virtually unlimited computing power anytime and in any place. Every week, it seems like there are breakthroughs, big and small. Just look at one product unveiled last week. Google announced that it has developed wireless headphones that can translate 40 languages in real time. Amazing. The universal translator from Star Trek can now be yours. Yet again, science fiction has been made a reality. So stepping back, how big of an economic impact can these new technologies have? Well, a few recent studies try to answer that question. One analysis by Accenture projects that by increasing labor productivity and unlocking new innovations, AI alone could boost economic output annually by more than 75%. They estimate as much as $8.3 trillion in new growth for the year 2035 alone. There's similar potential for the next generation of wireless connectivity. The transition to the new wireless networks known as 5G promises to be more than just incremental change. We could see dramatic improvements in network speed and capacity and responsiveness that will make the impossible possible. One analysis by CTIA, the Wireless Industries Trade Association, suggests that 5G could create 3 million jobs and over $500 billion in additional economic growth over 7 years in the United States. Now, technology is also dramatically accelerating the pace of innovation. Back in President Reagan's era, it could take decades to develop complex systems like airplanes because you had to build physical prototypes and then test them extensively. But with virtual environments and 3D printing and simulations, product development that used to take decades can now take simply months. Now, a second key lesson that I've taken from President Reagan is the importance of setting clear priorities and sticking to them. One of his greatest strengths was that everybody knew what President Reagan stood for: cutting taxes and reducing the size of government and beating the communists. Well, my top priority is pretty simple, too. Going back to my first full day as chairman in January, I've said again and again and again that the FCC will focus foremost on bridging the digital divide. In my view, every American who wants to be a participant in, rather than a spectator of, the digital economy should be able to do so. It shouldn't matter where you live, what you look like, what language you speak, or any other personal attribute. And to make that happen, we at the FCC will embrace the free market. We will cut red tape. We will modernize our rules, and we will promote private ingenuity and investment instead of penalizing it. Well, why, you might ask, is this so important? It's because technology can help people rise. With a high-speed internet connection, you can start a business and immediately access a nationwide or even worldwide customer base. Through telemedicine, people who live in rural areas can be treated by a specialist hundreds of miles away in situations in which they might otherwise not get medical care at all. With connectivity, a farmer can use precision agriculture to boost his yield and to improve his livestock, to make his products as competitive as those anywhere in the world. And with the internet, any student anywhere can learn from the best minds and using the best materials. So if we bridge the digital divide, we can raise these distressed communities and bring new hope to people who feel like they've been left behind. But if we don't, the gap between those who have and those who don't will only widen. And unfortunately, the plain truth is that right now, we are not where we need to be. In urban areas, only 2% of residents lack access to high-speed fixed service. But in rural areas, over 1/4 don't have it. 93% of Americans earning $75,000 or more have home broadband or high-speed internet access service. But barely half of those making less than $30,000 do. And those are, of course, just numbers. We can't lose sight of the fact that the digital divide is about real people. Each percentage point on the wrong side of that divide represents hundreds of thousands of personal stories. Stories of entrepreneurs who want to take off but can't. Stories of families who want to educate their kids but can't. Stories of people who need high-quality health care but can't get it. Stories of families struggling in small towns as their neighbors move elsewhere to find a future. To learn firsthand about the digital divide and to help build momentum for closing it, I've gotten out of Washington. It is one thing to see the problem on the printed page in my office. It's another thing entirely to see it on the ground. And so I have met with Americans who are working in big cities and small towns alike to expand what I call digital opportunity. And my digital divide tour so far has taken me to 18 states, over 40 stops, and more than 4,000 miles in some pretty beat-up rental cars. I've had the privilege of meeting countless people during these travels to places like Wardensville, West Virginia, and Durand, Wisconsin, and Ozark, Missouri, and Casper, Wyoming. The people I meet and the places I go, those stories stay with me, perhaps more often than they know. And they help fuel my passion to help deliver digital opportunity to all Americans. And since President Reagan knew the power of a good story, I thought I'd share 3 of them with you today. There are, of course, many, many more. I will never forget meeting Steve Poirier during my visit to the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation in Mission, South Dakota. He told me the story of an elderly woman who was found dead in her home. She was found clutching her cell phone. She had dialed for help 38 times, but the call never went through. There just wasn't wireless coverage where she lived. I think of Dr. Shazam Hussain of the Cleveland Clinic. He explained how connectivity has allowed the clinic's mobile stroke unit, essentially a souped-up van with a lot of connectivity, to cut the average time that it takes to assess and stabilize a stroke patient by 38 minutes. And that's especially amazing when you consider that the brain loses 2 million brain cells every single minute when you're having a stroke. I think of David Jensen. 2 months ago, I had the chance to meet him. He's the superintendent of the Humboldt County School District in rural Nevada. And he told me how students in 5 rural and remote schools near the Oregon border are falling behind their urban peers. They simply don't have the bandwidth to take advantage of the latest digital learning tools. Time and again, my travels have reaffirmed my belief in the power of the internet to improve the lives of the American people and the costs when Americans are left in the analog era. But President Reagan taught me more than just the importance of setting priorities like closing the digital divide. A third key lesson was the timeless blueprint for actually achieving them. Consider this 1985 quote from Mark Fowler, President Reagan's first FCC chairman, a quote that applies today. "We want to eliminate as much as we can government regulation of the telecommunications marketplace so as to permit present players to provide new and innovative services to consumers, and likewise permit new players to come in and compete." And that's basically our approach today. The most powerful tool for expanding digital opportunity is market-based light-touch regulation, regulation that maximizes private investment in high-speed networks and benefits consumers. And that's why we have sought to break down the regulatory barriers to installing wireless and wireline infrastructure. Too often, government at all levels makes it hard for companies to construct these next-generation networks, many of which are very expensive and difficult to build. And so we're focused on cutting as much of this red tape as we can. As Chairman Fowler put it, the telecom sector should be Exhibit A for Adam Smith, in that both the consumer and the businessman can be better off in a free market. This FCC is also trying to make it easier for new technologies and services to enter the marketplace. We have approved the first of the next generation of satellite constellations. We've encouraged new fixed wireless companies to innovate. And we've proposed to make it easier for small fiber companies to string lines, whether they're in the bayou of Louisiana or in inner city Detroit. And I've seen each of those personally for myself. Now, all of these steps promote more competition and benefit consumers at the end of the day. Another page we're adopting from the Reagan playbook involves cost-benefit analysis. President Reagan once joked that economists are the sort of people who see something work in practice and wonder if it would work in theory. But he understood their value behind the punchline. He was the first president to require executive branch analysis to ensure that the costs of rules don't outweigh their benefits. Pretty basic step when you think about it, but a revolutionary one at the time. Now, as an independent agency, the FCC has long been exempt from that requirement. Too often it hasn't met that standard. Indeed, too often it doesn't even try. To correct this, I have proposed to establish an Office of Economics and Data at the FCC. And this office will leverage the expertise of staff economists who don't currently have a seat at the policymaking table. And as a result, going forward, economics and cost-benefit analysis in particular will be a core part of the FCC's policy work, not an afterthought. One last lesson I'm trying to take from President Reagan is to seek bipartisan consensus whenever I can. President Reagan, of course, was a principled conservative. But he struck so many deals with his Democratic counterpart in the House, Speaker Tip O'Neill, that there is actually a book about it. As the president put it, if I can get 70% or 80% of what it is I'm trying to get, well, I'll take that, and I'll try to get the rest in the future. Well, I've taken the same tack. In my very first decision as chairman of the FCC, I urged my colleagues successfully to extend $170 million in federal funding to bring internet access to unserved rural areas in New York State. Now, notably, this plan was negotiated with Governor Andrew Cuomo, whose father rather famously said some unkind words about President Reagan in 1984, as well as Senator Chuck Schumer, who somewhat less famously has said some unkind words about me. And since I took the gavel, I've tried to restore the collaborative and the collegial atmosphere that so long has defined the FCC. I've enabled commissioners to make their voices heard. I have empowered commissioners to vote on important decisions, instead of having subordinate bureaus decide them. I visited a hurricane-ravaged region with a Democratic colleague. And under my leadership, about 80% of the major matters we vote on at our monthly meetings have been bipartisan and without dissent, compared to less than 50% under my predecessor. And I do these things not just because I used to be a commissioner in the minority, but because I truly believe that when all hands are on deck, when every commissioner has a stake in the decision, when the FCC can speak with a unified voice, our decisions are better for the country. They stand the test of time, and they produce value that I think Americans across the country expect. Now, in his January 1989 farewell address, President Reagan said, "We did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference." And to me, that's what public service is all about. I am not here to hold a title. I'm here to get something done for the American people. And I couldn't be more excited about the opportunities that lie ahead. I believe in my heart that it is morning in digital America. The challenges before us are great, but the opportunities are so much greater. It's time for us to be bold, for as President Reagan told us in his unforgettable speech following the Challenger disaster, the future does not belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. It's time for us to dream big, for as President Reagan told us, America is too great for small dreams. It's time for us to act, for as Reagan told us, we hope that those who come after us will say of us that in our time, we did everything that could be done. And with that, I will close on a personal note. They said that Reagan loved the American dream because he lived it. That rings true to me. I spoke earlier about how much my love and reverence for this country comes from growing up in Ronald Reagan's America. But even more so, it came from living in the house of Raj and Radha Pai. My parents know a little something about the American dream. They came to this country 46 years ago with literally nothing other than $10, a transistor radio, and a desire to achieve the American dream. I think of all those sacrifices they made, all those risks they took, all those hours they worked, all those moments when they worried about what the future must hold, and how proud they were to make it and to give me and my sister a better future. And then I think about what Ronald Reagan said on the last full day of his presidency. Since this is the last speech that I will give as president, he said, I think it's fitting to leave one final thought, an observation about a country I love. It was stated best in a letter I received not long ago. A man wrote to me and said, "You can go live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German or a Turk or a Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American." My parents came to this country from India. But when it comes to embodying the values and principles of our great land, in many ways, they are the most American people I know. In the early 1980s, they quickly became fans of President Reagan. They have been ever since. They too see the shining city on the hill. They knew, and I know, that America's best days have just begun. Thank you, Mr. President, for what you did for me. Thank you, Mr. President, for what you did for my parents. And thank you, Mr. President, for what you did for this great nation, the last best hope for man on earth. May God bless you, and God bless the United States.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I know I can speak for everybody who works here that it was extraordinary to hear your connection to Ronald Reagan and to have you explain what we all know here, that Ronald Reagan is absolutely relevant today. And we appreciate that. Now, he has agreed to take some questions, and a number of you actually wrote them out. I appreciate that. So we're going to start with one that I think probably affects all of you. I'm interested to see if it affects the chairman personally. Here we go. I thought the FCC was supposed to limit robocalls, but even though I've placed myself on the do not call list, I've been getting more and more in recent months. What can we do to make this stop?
Well, whoever wrote that question, you will be happy to know that when it comes to this issue, I'm not just a regulator, I am a victim. I get robocalls all the time on my work-issued phone. It is the #1 category of complaints that we get to the FCC from consumers, and that is why I announced as my first major enforcement initiative that this was going to be our top consumer protection priority, was getting rid of these unwanted and illegal robocalls. And it's not just a nuisance to people as you're going about your daily business. Thousands of Americans are scammed each and every day by some of these robocalls, some of which are our most vulnerable populations, the elderly, recent immigrants, and the like. And the scams are legion. Some people will call it pretending to be an agent from the IRS. And I don't care if you've paid your taxes going back 50 years. If you hear the IRS, the hair on the back of your neck might stand up a little bit, and you might sit up and listen. So one of the things that we have done is, both on the front end, to make it easier for carriers to block what are called spoofed numbers. That's where you get a call that seems to be from your area code, might even seem to be from the 3-digit prefix. So you think, well, it's local pharmacy or my kid's school calling, but it's actually a scammer. Those are called spoofed calls, and we're taking aggressive action, including later this month, to help carriers block those calls. On the back end, so to speak, we're also taking very aggressive enforcement action. Under my leadership, we've proposed the largest fine ever in the FCC's history, and forget about Howard Stern. This is a guy in Florida who unleashed, in the last 3 months of 2016 alone, over 100 million robocalls on American consumers. One guy, one state, $120 million we are proposing to fine him. There have been others as well that we've announced. Additionally, one of the privileges of having this position is you get to coordinate with some of your counterparts from other countries. We do have the do not call list, which the questioner mentioned. Unfortunately, the do not call list is not respected by scammers who lie beyond our borders, who just don't care about the law. What we've seen is a lot of these robocalls are launched from call centers abroad. There are actual businesses set up for the express purpose of robocalling American consumers in order to get a quick buck. And so I've spoken with my counterparts in India, for example, and I've urged them, look, if we find call centers that are engaging in this kind of activity, I need your cooperation. We cannot do it alone in the United States. And I'm gratified to say that he, in particular, the chairman of the Indian FCC, has volunteered his assistance, where our staffs are working together. And so hopefully by the time we are done at the FCC, you'll be able to actually answer the phone with confidence, because you'll know it's not coming from a scammer looking for a buck. It's coming from a friend who might also be looking for a buck, but at least you know who that person is.
Great, thank you. Okay, I saw the YouTube video that you did in May of this year where you read and responded to mean tweets. Hashtag people are rude. In today's internet environment, where so much is anonymous and people write the rudest and meanest thoughts, do you have any thoughts yourself or any advice on the guidance? Just because you can say it doesn't mean you should.
I was the first FCC commissioner back in 2012 who went on Twitter, and my colleagues at the time told me, you're crazy. Rule number one of the internet, do not feed the trolls. But I have found social media to be useful in trying to get my message out, and also to hear from people about some of their concerns. And some of the initiatives that I've championed during my time at the FCC have been as a result of tweets. For example, several years ago, a man in Texas had a daughter who was killed in a Marshall, Texas hotel room. She went to meet her estranged husband at a hotel room, and when she first got there with her 3 children, he started stabbing her. Her 9-year-old daughter raced to call 911 on the phone, but the call never went through because he had to dial 9 first in order to reach an outside line. She tragically lost her life, but this man, Hank Hunt, wanted to start a campaign to change how this worked. And he thought, I'm just an individual in Marshall, Texas. What can I do? Well, a few weeks after that event, this story was tweeted to me. A week after that, I talked to Hank on the phone. A month after that, I started a campaign in which I sent a letter to the CEOs of the top 10 hotel chains in the United States and the Lodging Association. I said, look, we need to solve this problem. Now, if you check into a hotel, more likely than not, you won't have to dial a 9 in order to reach 911. All of this started because of a tweet. Now, that's a good side of things. Of course, with anonymity and with the age in which we live, there are going to be a lot of coarse comments. At this very moment, there are people who are sitting there doing nothing other than lobbing expletives at my Twitter handle, and I get that. People are very passionate about FCC issues. I am passionate about these issues as well. I take them seriously, but I don't take them personally. And I think one of the problems with our politics today is that we have substituted, instead of reason and judgment and a willingness to hear the other side, vitriol and pounding the table. That's just not the kind of person I am. Those of you who know me, and those of you who get to know me, will understand that I come to the table with a respect for the other side of any given issue. And at the end of the day, I try to conduct myself in a way that would make my family proud. Not to be cheesy about it, but I want to be worthy of the example that my parents set for me. I want my kids to know when they get older, yeah, Dad, you might have gotten it right, you might have gotten it wrong, but at least we can be proud of your public service. And that's why I try every day with my own staff, with the people I meet, with everybody, to be as respectful as I can be, and to make fun of myself. There are many ways to make fun of myself, as you can see in that Mean Tweets video, and some of them actually do indeed make me laugh, I have to say. So, especially the ones who comment on my buck teeth or all this kind of stuff, random. How people pick up on this stuff, I'll never know. But I never thought a mug of all things would become such a popular icon. But no, I really do try to be as respectful as I can be, despite the environment in which we live.
I recommend the YouTube piece. It'll take you just a few minutes. It'll make you laugh.
I really do hope my wife didn't write any of those.
Okay, the internet has created the, quote, democratization of entrepreneurship. But there are many rural areas, as you've mentioned, that lack access to broadband. How do we extend this democratization to outlying areas? What is the role of state and/or local government to create that infrastructure?
This is a great question, and it is at the heart of the digital divide, which is increasingly, as I pointed out, an urban-rural divide. This is where I spend a lot of time, and not just because I am from rural America. My own hometown is one of those that is on the wrong side, largely, of the digital divide. By definition, in some of these areas, there cannot be a business case, a strong business case for laying fiber or building those digital connections. The population is sparser, it tends to be poorer, and in a lot of cases, companies would rather spend their scarce capital deploying next-generation infrastructure in densely populated urban areas where they can get the better return on the investment. Well, we at the FCC want to change that. I want to change that. I want to build as strong a business case for all of these companies to deploy as possible. So there's several different tools in the toolbox, so to speak. One tool is federal subsidies. The FCC oversees what is called the Universal Service Fund. Those of you who have a phone bill, if you look on your bill, you'll see something that says Universal Service Fee or something like that. That money goes into a pot, and that pot is distributed by the FCC to various telecom carriers. One of the things that we did early on in my leadership at the FCC, in the first full month that I had the chance to set the agenda for the FCC, we got across the finish line, on a bipartisan basis, I might add, 2 key initiatives on using this Universal Service Fund money. One was a $4.5 billion plan over the next decade to bring 4G LTE to parts of the country that don't have it right now. Those of you who drive in rural areas, you might see that in a big city, you'll have 4 or 5 bars and good service, but the second you get out into a rural area, it drops to 1 or maybe even no bars. We want to change that, and that's going to take time. The second initiative was a $2 billion plan to provide fixed broadband to unserved parts of the country, places where there simply isn't fiber, for instance, today. And we want to incentivize all of the companies to compete, not just fiber providers, but satellite companies and wireless and the rest. Now, the reason why these were big deals was because historically, the FCC hadn't targeted unserved parts of the country. In some cases, we were subsidizing, say, a fourth or a fifth or even sixth wireless competitor in a part of the country that already had service. So we want to try to close the divide as best we can, spend those scarce funds where they're most needed. So federal subsidies, first tool in the toolbox. Second tool in the toolbox is modernizing our regulations. Just to give you one example, the FCC has rules on the books that in some cases require small telephone companies to maintain the copper lines that are in the ground at all costs. In some cases, these lines have been in the ground for decades, going back a century. Well, what we want to do is make sure that rural residents, people in these small towns, have access to fiber as well, to other advanced technologies. And by definition, every dollar that these companies have to spend maintaining copper is by definition a dollar they cannot spend on fiber. And so we're trying to modernize our rules to figure out how can we encourage these companies to connect everyone with the future of technology, not just maintain the fading networks of the past. And the third tool in the toolbox, which I should mention also, is working with elected officials. Early on in my time as chair, I urged the administration that to the extent the president proposed an infrastructure plan, to include broadband, digital infrastructure as a part of that. To me, of course, roads and bridges, exceptionally important. But in the 21st century, if we're talking about infrastructure and digital infrastructure isn't a part of it, that seemed to be an opportunity lost. And so I was grateful for the president a few months ago for saying that broadband would be a piece of it. I've also worked well with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and in both houses of Congress to encourage them to think creatively about this as well. Last September, before the election, because I did not want this to be a political issue that depended on who ran Congress or who ran the FCC, I proposed what I called gigabit opportunity zones. And the idea here was you could take a geographic area as small as a low-income inner-city county block or as large as a rural county. So long as the median income was 75% of the national median, Congress could allocate tax incentives to providers to build out networks in these areas, as well as relieving the payroll taxes for certain businesses that sprung up in those areas. A bipartisan group, Senator Capito, a Republican from West Virginia, and Senator Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, have championed this measure in the Senate. There's similar legislation in the House. I understand this is a very difficult political environment, but nonetheless, infrastructure seems to be one thing that really unites everybody. I have yet to see anybody, whether it was in inner city Detroit or in Wardensville, West Virginia, who said, yeah, we're pretty happy with the infrastructure we've got. We don't need any improvements. I think this is an area where elected officials could really put some points on the board, and look forward to working with them to make that a reality.
Okay, why
Sorry
was
to
it
filibuster about it. I know I talk a lot, but it's my number one passion.
why was it important for you to support the revitalizing of the AM radio band?
Well, I love AM radio. I grew up with AM radio. I still very vividly remember 30 years ago, this past spring, listening to KLKC 1530 AM in my hometown to hear my high school basketball team win the state basketball championship. My mom wouldn't let me go to the game, and I sullenly went to my room, like, I'll teach her. I pulled out the transistor radio and I listened to it. And I think about all my memories from AM radio, and it seems like everyone, at least over a certain age, has a very fond memory of AM radio. And that's why in 2012, I was the first FCC official in a generation to propose revitalizing this AM band. AM listening had gone down substantially since the 1970s. It was about 50-50 AM and FM in the 70s. It had declined substantially since then. And I thought there's a lot that we could do and should do to help revitalize this radio service, which is, after all, older than the FCC itself. It's one of the oldest communications services that we still have in this country. So we got some bipartisan reforms across the finish line in 2015. There are more that are teed up that I hope we can act upon. But to me, a lot of these AM radio stations are so important in the communities that they serve. They might be the only entity that is going to cover the local high school football game on Friday or the church service on Sunday. And I've visited a lot of these stations, KZPA in Fort Yukon, Alaska, WRDN in Durand, Wisconsin, WAGG in Birmingham, Alabama. I mean, these aren't just call signs to me. These are sort of the linchpins of their community in a lot of ways. And so I think it's important for the FCC, for any FCC, to help some of these radio stations thrive in an increasingly competitive media marketplace. And when we can do that is to make sure our regulations match 2017's realities as opposed to those in, say, 1975 or 1934.
Great. This is, of course, very important to a lot of people across the nation and here in California right now. What role do you believe the FCC should and can play in restoring infrastructure after storms in places like Puerto Rico and the firestorms like we have in Santa Rosa right now?
We have a very important role to play, and I will say that the bulk of my time over the past month or two has been spent on trying to coordinate efforts in response to Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, and soon the firestorms in California. Some of these storms are just devastating to these populations, of course, and one of the critical parts of helping these communities get back on their feet is getting the communications networks back up and running. The realities depend on the particular situation. In Harvey, for instance, only about 5% of wireless sites were down. They had big problems, however, with flooding. I mean, 33 trillion gallons of water were dumped on Houston and the surrounding area. That's a huge, huge problem. One of the lessons we've learned from there is that fiber is actually much more resilient than copper. In those areas which had fiber, the water pressure doesn't matter as much to fiber since it's essentially just a piece of glass that you're putting a signal through, whereas in those areas that had copper, the water pressure was simply so great that the copper degraded or just simply disintegrated. There wasn't any left. Same thing in southern Florida. I visited there with Commissioner Clyburn, as I mentioned in my remarks. There, the winds were so powerful that they just simply knocked down a lot of utility poles and power lines. And so it's been a struggle to figure out where the outages are in some cases. And Puerto Rico is just the worst of the cases. And I spent a lot of time, including yesterday and the day before, reading some of these reports, talking to folks down there. And I'll simply mention, because they deserve mention, that the head of the FCC might get all the headlines, all the credit, and all the blame, but the staff of the FCC does heroic work. We have folks on the ground in Puerto Rico. We've had folks in Miami and folks in Houston who are just incredible in coordinating with FEMA, with state officials, with private companies and the like to help keep people safe. And they are the ones, honestly, who deserve so much credit. And so we have a very big role. One of the roles we have in Puerto Rico that I'll mention is what's called the Disaster Information Reporting System, or DIRS. I love some of the acronyms we come up in Washington. You have to check the DIRS, and my wife looks at me like, what was that again? But so this is essentially when we activate DIRS, typically at the request of the Department of Homeland Security and/or FEMA. We'll activate it for particular counties, and we'll tell communications providers in those counties, okay, tell us if your network is up and running, tell if it's not. Tell us if your broadcast station is up and running in that county, tell us if it's not. And that helps us get literally a map of where these networks might be down, and it helps us coordinate relief efforts. And it's been very helpful for us when I talk to the administrator of FEMA or to others to be able to say, look, we have some really big outages here. We could use some help in terms of getting the power up to get those networks up and running. So to me, at least, this is not just one of the many missions. It's one of our core missions. The very first section of the Communications Act says that the Congress created the FCC in 1934 in part to protect the safety and life and property through the use of communication services. And to me, at least, this is probably our highest calling.
In a related question, we have someone who is interested if you could comment on the role of amateur radio communication and operators in these disaster areas.
They do tremendous work, and the amateur radio folks who are in some of these affected communities are really dedicated. I mean, they sprint to the site of the trouble because they want to help, and especially if the networks are down, amateur radio operators can often be a lifeline to help coordinate people in moments of need. That's certainly the case in Puerto Rico, and I've seen it, I've heard about it in Houston, that there have been a lot of folks who just give up what they're doing and they want to help, and this is the way they can do it. So I'm grateful to all the amateur radio folks out there. They're really dedicated, hardworking, and people with a lot of ingenuity who bring every skill they have to bear in order to help people keep people safe.
Yes, we have a large amateur radio group in this area that comes to the library once a year and has a whole program if anybody's interested.
And they're all licensed, right?
Absolutely.
I just want to make sure. I mean, I know everything that happens at the Reagan Library has to stay at the Reagan Library, but still, it's, you know.
Okay, we have a couple more questions for you, and I think we have just enough time. If we view a 5G build-out as a moonshot, how do we incentivize infrastructure and spectrum sharing to ensure that our rocket wins the race?
Boy, that's a really good question. It's a challenging question, in part because we are not operating in a vacuum within the borders of the United States. Other countries have seen what the US has done with 4G. We are the world leaders in 4G. When I came on board at the FCC, we had 4% of the world's population, but 50% of the world's 4G LTE subscriptions. Other countries see that success, and they want to beat us when it comes to 5G. And China, in particular, and Europe, they want to advance the ball as quickly as possible. And in some cases, they're able to do that because they simply have one level of government. The Chinese government can simply say by fiat, we shall be deploying 5G infrastructure everywhere, and that's the way it's going to be. And in the United States, there are, of course, different challenges in terms of geography and the regulatory environment. So one of the things we've tried to do is figure out how can we tailor the regulatory burden so that we protect the public interest while still making sure that we have the ability to deploy this infrastructure quickly. And the reason I say that is that the wireless networks of the future are going to look very different from the wireless networks we know today. Today, when you think of a wireless network, you probably think of a 100-foot cell tower that communicates with your device at a certain power level. Well, the networks of the future are going to look completely different. Instead of a big cell tower, we're going to see hundreds of thousands of small cells. This is infrastructure that in some cases you could even hold in your hand or that are no larger than a pizza box. And they'll be relatively less obtrusive. You could just attach them to a utility pole, put them on top of or on the side of a building and the like. You might not often see them if you don't really look for them. And so the question is, should we make those same kinds of small cell type infrastructure subject to the same regulations that applied or that still apply to big cell towers? Should they have to go through the same levels of environmental review, for instance? Should the historic preservation rules apply to those? Should we have every single level of government, federal, state, local, and tribal, reviewing every single one of these hundreds of thousands of deployments on a deployment by deployment basis? I mean, if that's the case, then we're going to slow down dramatically the deployment of that 5G infrastructure. And so part of what we teed up at the FCC is a whole bunch of questions to solicit public input. How should the United States think about the 5G future? Should we stick with the old model that we've got, which has been useful when it came to 4G, but might not well be suited for the networks of the future? Or should we be more forward-thinking? And that's one of the things we're going to have to sort out is how to, as I said, tailor the regulatory burden to the nature of deployment. I can tell you that other countries are very eager, as I said, to take the lead in 5G when it comes to infrastructure. The other piece of the equation which is very important, which was mentioned, was spectrum. The airwaves that we all use every day are incredibly important. I mean, they're obviously one of the critical parts of a wireless network. And here too, over the last 8 months or so under my leadership, we've been very aggressive in trying to tee up more spectrum to get out there in the commercial marketplace. I announced recently that by the end of the year, we would be voting on a final order that would get some of the spectrum into the commercial marketplace, very high band spectrum above 24 gigahertz. And just to give you a sense of how ridiculously incredible that is, when I got into this business back in the late 90s, it was thought that spectrum above, say, 2 gigahertz or definitely 3 gigahertz was unusable for wireless communications. I mean, in those days, it was 700 megahertz or 900 or maybe PCS spectrum. But now we're talking about spectrum at 28 gigahertz or all the way up to even beyond that could be usable for wireless communications. I sort of take the field of dreams approach when it comes to spectrum. You know, if you build it, they will come, for those of you who are Kevin Costner fans. I feel like if the FCC gets the spectrum into the commercial marketplace, the innovators, the entrepreneurs will come. They will figure out the ways to make this work. They have the ingenuity that no government agency could ever dictate. And so we're hopeful to get that out there for the cellular companies to use. There's also unlicensed spectrum, which I talked about in my remarks. And here too, we're trying to get as much spectrum out there as we possibly can, both in the high band spectrum, in mid band, and in low band. Those of you who use Wi-Fi all the time, I assume that's probably all of you. Perhaps some of you at this very moment who are bored with my remarks. You probably use Wi-Fi all the time, and I'm always amazed at some of these surveys that suggest that one of the first things people do when they check into a hotel is to check to see whether there's Wi-Fi. what a change in a generation. I mean, 20 years ago, if someone said, yeah, the first thing you're going to do is pull a device out of your phone and try to connect it to some wireless network, I mean, you're crazy. You're more worried about the continental breakfast or whether it has a swimming pool or whatever. But that's a really critical input, and that goes across businesses all over the place. So we want to get not just Wi-Fi, but all kinds of unlicensed applications out there. And so I'm really bullish about where things go from here. We're just at the dawn of the Internet of Things, and I think, as I said, if the FCC does its job over the next couple of years, there's no telling what our kids and our kids' kids are going to be doing in terms of wireless applications. I just hope I'm around to see it.
Well, I know I've been enlightened tonight, so I have one question,
Okay.
more on a personal nature. I'd like to know, when you started working as chairman of the FCC, what was the most surprising thing you discovered that the FCC affects or controls every day?
Oh, boy, that's a good question. So you have their whole panoply of responsibilities, some of which are obviously substantial, trying to set the agenda for the agency, some of which are very mundane. The FCC is moving, and we have to figure out how many cubicles are we going to have, how high should the walls go, what should the carpet be like, that kind of stuff. I guess the most enjoyable and unexpected role has been meeting and getting to know my foreign counterparts. One of the things that amazes me is that people just pay so much attention to what the FCC does around the world. I mean, you might not think it. I sometimes give these speeches or issue these statements. I wonder if they just go out into the ether, but everyone around the world pays attention to what the United States says and does. And it's remarkable when I meet with my counterparts from Mexico or Brazil or India or Argentina or Europe that they actually follow our statements. They say, oh, what you did on Spectrum, that's very forward-thinking. We would like to do that. Or, you know, what are you thinking in terms of infrastructure? How can we work together on robocalling, getting to work with the Indian chairman? And so to know that whatever the challenges that we have domestically are, at least internationally, we still project strength, and that the FCC chair has the ability to help drive that relationship, to deepen the relationship with some of these countries is something I certainly didn't expect. There are also some national security responsibilities, which I knew about, but I didn't appreciate the full gravity of. I mean, when you're getting these classified briefings and you see some of the threats that are out there and what some of your responsibilities would be if a disaster struck, it's daunting. And you know, to be honest, I'm just the leader of an independent agency. I mean, can you imagine if you're the president of the United States or the head of the Department of Defense? I mean, the responsibilities are even greater. And so it gives me a firsthand appreciation for the folks at all levels of government who help to keep us safe, the intelligence community and law enforcement and all the rest. There are a lot of bad people out there in the world, but there are a lot of really good people here who are determined to keep them at bay. And to be a tiny little piece of that infrastructure is something that is very, very rewarding.
Well, thank you very much. I know I speak for myself and probably others here when we say we really appreciate. I truly have been enlightened. I understand a lot more about the FCC than I ever did.
You say that to all the chairmen.
No, remember, you're the first. I think it's nice to put a face to the FCC finally. The bad news is that the next robocall you get, you're going to put a face to the robocall.
You've been great, everybody. I'll see you later.
So
right.
Thank you very much for coming. And
thank you. Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll bear with us as we escort the chairman out, I do want to make sure that you know on November 8th, we have an extraordinary event. We still have some seats available. The Bush sisters are coming. Jenna Bush Hager and Barbara Bush are going to be here.